look at how organized we are. We knew right where to sit. We didn't even have to practice. I just want to say, first of all, I am so honored to be here tonight and with our Vietnam veterans. I cannot believe it's 50 years. I'm sure none of us can believe it's 50 years, and I'm sure all of you think about it every single day. So I want to start, and I'm going to start with you, Admiral McRaven. You were commissioned in 1977. One of the things we obviously saw with Patrick Nugent and the Vietnam veterans in our audience tonight is that pain never, ever goes away. It's different. Your pain is bigger, I think, than any veteran because of what you saw and the reception you did not get when you came back. So, Admiral, on this 50th anniversary, tell us your thoughts. I mean, this came suddenly, probably, for all of you, not so suddenly. And what it was like in 1977 after that war had ended.
Yeah, well, first, Martha, let me thank the veterans for being here tonight. And let me tell you something, because when I think about where we are today, we have, the allergies are really bad here in Austin, I might add. We have the finest military in the world today because the men and women sit out there. Viet can tell you, Joe McGuire can tell you, Paul can tell you, Edgar can tell you that the military today is a result of everything we learned from the veterans that served in Vietnam. Everything. I mean, we grew up in 1977. Joe McGuire and I are going to SEAL training. All of our instructors were Vietnam vets. And the service and the sacrifice that you guys put forward served us not just in 1977, but you think about everything that followed. You think about Panama and Grenada and Kosovo and Bosnia and Iraq and Afghanistan. Thousands upon thousands upon thousands of lives have been saved because of you guys. Don't ever forget that. But, the practical lessons I would offer, from our standpoint, the first thing that we learned is, again, the quality of the American soldier, sailor, airman, Marine, and those that served over there. As Pat said, I mean, they did their duty, they served. They were the best of America. And I think what happened after Vietnam and the realization that we did not treat the Vietnam vets well, the next big one that comes along for us is, interestingly enough, of course, you had Panama and you had Grenada, Kosovo, but when Desert Storm happened, there was a very interesting transition. I don't know who started it, but somebody came out with a bumper sticker that said, "We support the troops." And it fundamentally changed how we looked at the military, because it didn't say we support the war. It said we support the troops. And ever since then, what you've seen is this remarkable outpouring for men and women in uniform and those that served overseas, because you don't have to be for or against the war, but you have to understand the service and sacrifice of the people that went before you. And you have to admire that. And in admiring that, you have to support the troops. So again, the benefits that we see today, everything from the tactical to what the American public have lavished upon us as Iraq and Afghanistan vets, started here.
I'm going to dive into those lessons in a minute, but I do want, David, for you to talk about what you just saw with the allergies as well.
Well, I'm at that. So, we were going to be introduced by the voice of God. This is the voice of God right here.
Believe me, I know. Yeah.
I wrote a book about both the soldiers in Vietnam and the protesters in the United States. And what I've often said is that that the people of that era didn't have a Vietnam to learn from. World War II was completely different. And so I think one of the important lessons that all of the, anti-war protesters that I interviewed, and certainly all those soldiers already understood, is exactly what Admiral McRaven said. You can oppose a war, but you don't oppose the soldiers. And that was a lesson learned after Vietnam, because there was nothing to learn
It's
from that.
remarkable to me to think how that ever happened, how they were opposed to the troops, especially with the draft. It's really
The
extraordinary.
draft had something to do with that, actually.
And yet, blaming them is what I mean, obviously.
As I said, I mean, why did it happen? I think there was an enormous cultural changes going on during that period. Police officers were also subjected to that same sort of ridicule. And many people regret it, but it did happen during that era. There's peer pressure, people feel something that they regret later, and that's why it happened. But I would say that, I'm here in honor of the soldiers that I wrote about, the 60 men from the Black Lions Battalion who were killed in Vietnam, including Terry de la Mesa Allen, the battalion commander, and his daughter is here tonight. And also the 60 who survived this horrendous battle. And those soldiers, many of them did come home to hostility. Many of them didn't tell their stories to their families. They buried the whole Vietnam experience until about the time that I started researching this book was 25 years after the fact. Around 2000, with the internet coming into play, they found each other again. And that was an important moment for these soldiers. One of them, Faustin Sena, said he had a headache his whole life, except when he drove 500 miles to be with his buddies. And that's the way that so many of them felt during that era.
And I David knows this. I tell everybody about David's book. If you have not read They Marched into Sunlight, it is an absolutely beautiful book, and it will tell you so much about that war and that time of life. And it inspired me. I read it when it first came out, and have been inspired by it ever since. So I'm pretty honored to see you tonight, David. General, you came to this country as a political refugee from Vietnam at the age of 9.
Yes.
So when you think about this 50th anniversary, it's more complicated for you.
Yes, it's quite complicated for me. And to the veterans out there, I salute you. I'm part of your legacy. It's pretty hard to talk about, like I was telling you before. And really, to understand my story, you have to understand the totality of my background. So I'll just start with that. My parents were born actually in North Vietnam during a very tumultuous time that witnessed Japanese occupation, the Great Famine of the 1940s that killed 1.5 million North Vietnamese, as well as the French defeated Dien Bien Phu in the transition to the Viet Minh government. My father was born fiercely anti-France, like most Northern Vietnamese were, but after a while and after witnessing Viet Minh atrocities in the countryside, he decided to join the French commandos in the 1950s and became a very decorated French Marine warrant with several awards for honor, for valor. My mom, on the other side, she was born into a very wealthy land-owning family, and her family actually endured quite a bit with the agrarian reform that the Viet Minh executed in North Vietnam. 43 members of her family was killed and executed without trial. Her maternal grandfather was staked at a rice field, murdered, tortured, and left to rot for 3 days. So our background was very different. So our parents left everything in North Vietnam after the signing of the peace accord. My father went south to continue to fight against the communists, and he became one of the first Vietnamese Marine Corps officers when he joined the 1st Marine Battalion as an infantry officer. So when 1975 came around, March, April time frame, my father was the executive officer to the Marine 3-star. He was a major at the time, so he had a pretty good outlook on not only the tactical situation, but the strategic situation. He knew the country was going to fail, and due to our background, our American friends decided that, hey, we have to kind of facilitate this family's departure because we would not have done well under the communist regime. So on the 27th of April, our friends facilitated our passage to Tan Son Nhut airfield. And after surviving 2 days of bombardment and mortar and artillery fire, we were rescued by Lieutenant General Carey's 9th Marines onto the decks of the USS Hancock. And I remember that day very clearly because I remember we thought we were on some island right off the coast of South Vietnam. And we didn't know because it was a short flight. And I remember tucking on my father's shirt, asking him where we were at. And I remember him to this day telling me, well, we're on the USS Hancock. And I said, what does that mean? And he says, it means that no one can harm you now.
Okay.
And I'm pretty sure that was the moment when I decided that one day I'm going to serve. I'm going to pay back to this great country. So after graduating from the home of the Heisman Trophy, sir, University of Southern California,
We'll talk afterwards.
I became an infantry officer, and did 34 years in the military. And if I were asked today, and I'm sure you feel the same way, sir, to put on the uniform and to continue to serve, I would do that today. Thank you.
Thank you. I just want to follow up a little on that. I have a family that we've helped come over from Afghanistan. The kids are about what your age is, and I've often wondered what they will remember about escaping from Afghanistan. What was it like when you got here? What was it like with the atmosphere in this country?
We live in a great country. I grew up in a very poor area in Los Angeles and learned quite a bit of Spanish. A lot of my friends were Mexican Americans, and they didn't have a whole lot. But I remember, we're Catholic, so we were provided a lot of assistance from the Catholic Church there, the Queen of Angels there in Los Angeles. But we were really embraced. And just when you realize that you're in a great country, because they not only became good friends, but they came around with used household goods, with food, with translation assistance and all kinds of stuff, and was really able to connect us to the community very fast. So I didn't feel isolated at all, really. And we quickly became Americans. I remember watching the Olympics in 1976 and cheering for the red, white, and blue and all the great athletes that we had, and became a Dodgers fan, Lakers, LA Kings, and Raiders.
Just rubbing that in. Okay, your turn. Admiral, you talk about the lessons learned. And I remember once sitting in Iraq with General John Vines. And we were in the middle of a sandstorm up near Mosul. H.R. McMaster was there. And things were really starting to turn bad in Iraq. And Lieutenant General Vines said, he started apologizing to all the soldiers who were there, saying, we didn't learn all the lessons we should have from Vietnam. And basically what we said is, we'll never do this again. We'll never let this happen again. Certainly not a good lesson to learn, because you never know. But talk about what we didn't learn and what we did learn.
Yeah, so take it back a little bit, because David said something that was very important. So you think about World War II. So here we are, the victors of World War II. We kind of saved the Western democracies. We saved Europe. And so we came off World War II in this kind of American exceptionalism. Korea happens, and we feel compelled, because obviously we did well in Europe. We did well in Asia. So we can probably stop the communists, the North Koreans, and the Chinese from coming south. We weren't prepared for North Korea, but we held our own. MacArthur, comes away with the Incheon landing. So now all of a sudden Vietnam happens, and I think that there is this belief that we're on a roll here. So we can figure out a way to help the South Vietnamese to keep, again, the domino effect from occurring. And so obviously we jump into Vietnam with a little bit of mission creep. And one of the things, of course, that we all know as military officers is the biggest concern is mission creep. You go in to get a job done, and the next thing you know, somebody has decided, well, while you're in there, you might as well do this, and then before long you're in Afghanistan for 20 years, right? So we understand the lessons of mission creep. We understand the lessons that it's rarely good to get involved in another country's internal politics. But after Vietnam, what happens is, once again, we have a little bit of a string of good runs. We get into Grenada, we get into Panama, Kosovo, Bosnia, and so that string of Desert Storm, that string of runs looks pretty good. And so I think you got to put it in a little bit of context. Then all of a sudden Iraq happens. And once again, I think we're a little bit on this high that, hey, we can do this. And of course, we forgot, to John Vine's point, we forgot the lessons of Vietnam because we had a very short attention span, I think. But so anytime you get involved in another country's internal politics, you better understand what your exit strategy is, how you're going to try to accomplish that mission in a short time span, because the American people rarely have the staying power to make it happen long term. But on the good side, and I'll go back to what I was saying earlier, all of the tactics, techniques, and procedures that the men and women sitting out here learned, those were passed on to guys like Viet and me and Mike Kershaw is in the audience here, and Joe McGuire, a lot of those of us that fought in Iraq and Afghanistan, and they transitioned. We understood insurgency and counterinsurgency. We understood how to shoot, move, and communicate. We understood how to fly into a combat zone. Those lessons helped train the helicopter pilots and the C-123 pilots and the ground guys. So those lessons were good. The lesson of the non-commissioned officer sounds kind of small when you think of it in the big scale, but let me tell you, we are the greatest military in the world today because we trust the sergeants and the petty officers to do their job. And so this and when Iraq and Afghanistan happens, we don't have the size of the military that we had. We have scaled down. It's an all-volunteer military. So you have to rely on the young captains. You have to rely on the sergeants and the sergeant majors and the chief petty officers. And in spite of all the difficulty that was out there, the soldiers on the ground did a remarkable job in Iraq and Afghanistan. The politics always comes into play. It's something that is, we go out there to do our job. 1975, so this week, I was here at the ROTC unit. Saigon falls, and we had a Marine colonel who was our Marine option instructor at the time. And we had an old place called the Crow's Nest, which was where all the midshipmen had as a co-op. And we bring him over, it was on Friday. We bring him over on Friday night, and he had lost a lot of guys in Vietnam. He was a 2 or 3 Silver Star recipient, multiple Purple Hearts. And we wanted to know, what was he feeling? What was he going through? And he said, my Marines went over there, we served, we did our job. I've got to be proud of that, and that's what I take away from my service in Vietnam. And so when I see the struggles that we've had in Afghanistan in particular, and my soldiers, sailors, airmen, Marines come to me, I said, we did the best we could. We did our job, we took care of our fellow soldiers, we did what America asked us to do, and that's all you can ask.
And I agree completely with you. And when you see the soldiers and Marines and airmen in Iraq and Afghanistan, they did the best they could. It's always the policy. It's always the politics. David, I want to ask you the same thing. When you look at this, at Vietnam, and the lessons we did or did not learn, and in a broader sense, as a journalist, you can look at that in a very different way, and you can see the policy, and you certainly know that the men and women did the best they could.
Well, I was researching and writing my book while Iraq was happening. Mm-hmm. And for all the differences, the parallels were sort of haunting, where there were questions about why the war started, about how they would ever end, about where there were no front lines. We didn't speak the language for the most part. And there were serious questions about the role of dissent in American life and what it means and what patriotism means. So all of those arguments were in the air in 2000 and in the early 2000s, just as they were back in the 1960s. And so, and then you had a government that was saying, well, we did learn the lessons of Vietnam and we're not going to ever do that again. But I would argue that many of the lessons they learned were the wrong ones, whereas the actual soldiers learned the right lessons.
And when you look at it, General, the lessons learned from your perspective and what you have seen.
Yeah, so what I can do is really reflect on the conversations I had with my father, who served as a Marine officer in Vietnam, and also a lot of his colleagues. From the Vietnamese perspective, sir, you talk about meddling in the politics. I think the turning point for them, from their perspective, is actually the assassination of Diem and how he prosecuted that war. Now, I'm not going to advocate for President Diem and some of the things that were done, but from the Vietnamese side of the house, they saw that the counterinsurgency aspect of it, which should done by the locals, was a lot more effective than what it had become. Now, do we have the stomach to be able to do that? I'm not certain as a nation, but they saw that as an issue. And then the other thing that was very, very interesting is, we as Americans, we're not very patient. 10, 20 years for us is a long time. In Asia, that just, a blink of an eye. And for them, for the Vietnamese, they're very frustrated because they thought the war could have been won. Now, we can be here all day talking about tactics and strategy and all that, but they thought that with two things, with the broadening of really the resources and combat operations against the North Vietnamese, and with a little more time to develop the Vietnamese, South Vietnamese military. Because my father, I remember him coming home, with a 3-star general as his executive officer, coming home beaming, saying, you know how awesome the Vietnamese Marine company commanders and platoon leaders were, and we can win this war. We have great NCOs, and we have great officer. All we needed was time, and they thought that, too little, too late, And the other thing, too, is the shift of strategy. Sir, you spoke about that, from going from, General Westmoreland, who I think the world of, he was ROC 6 as well, and in the old days, the same unit I had commanded, and, he's a warrior through and through, but his experience, World War II in Korea, and we did a lot of that stuff, the search and destroy mission, and the really a more conventional prosecution of the war. You had General Abrams come in and was more clear and hold, and let's go ahead and professionalize the South Vietnam Army and all that. I think, in my perspective, a better strategy, but too little, too late, because he did that for 4 years, and it was time for us as a nation to get out of Vietnam, because we didn't have the will to stay, and the sacrifices were great, but the South Vietnamese are very bitter about that, and they believe that they could have won a war with our help. So,
I would respectfully disagree about General Westmoreland. I don't think he was a great general, and I think he made many mistakes. The biggest one was that he thought they could win the war like General Grant in the Civil War.
Sure.
Just search and destroy, find, through battles of attrition, and I think that was a huge mistake.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. But the thing is, I still think he's a great general. I mean, he's done a lot for our country in World War II and Korea, and you really can't take that away. But yeah, his strategy.
You should be the journalist here too.
No.
Cynical. Bring us in.
I'm not cynical. I'm skeptical. I'm never
skeptical.
There's
better
a
word.
difference.
Much better word. Let's talk about a little bit the relationship with the press. Speaking of journalists, but I want to start with you, Admiral McRaven. You were a journalism major. In what happened? You're such a failure.
Well, yeah, I couldn't do math, I couldn't do science, I couldn't do accounting, and there were actually good-looking women in journalism, and when you're 19 years old, that's always a good reason to...
The truth comes out.
Wait, this is Chatham House rules, right? So, I couldn't do math, I couldn't do science.
That's why I chose it as well, yeah.
But,
exactly.
But I enjoyed writing. I enjoyed the craft of writing, and people always kind of laughed about, well, why would a journalism degree be good for somebody going into the military? Because, you understand, most of your job as an officer in the military is you got to convey your ideas, you got to do it clearly, concisely, you write reports, you also stand in front of general officers and brief them, and these are all skills that I learned in my time here at UT. So, it turned out to be a great major for me.
I always tell kids who are interested in journalism not to go into journalism, by the way. I tell them to go to political science or major in history or do something broader, but you seem to have done okay. But let's talk about the relationship, because the press was a huge part of Vietnam and really the first real-time images of what was happening in that turning point when Walter Cronkite said he thought it was a stalemate. Obviously I'm going to ask you about this too, David, but I do want to start from your perspective, since you were so close to the end of the war when that continued for decades.
Yeah, as we were talking a little bit backstage, it was interesting because, I come into the military in 1977, the war is over by 1975, but of course it was the nightly news that shaped America's thinking about Vietnam. So as I watched it, when Desert Shield and Desert Storm came, each of the services kind of took a little bit of a different approach. A lot of the services, frankly, a little bit of the Army, not so much the Army, but the Air Force and the Navy, were a little concerned about journalists being too close to the airman and the sailor. So yes, they brought journalists out on ships and they took them to flight lines, but a lot of it was carefully choreographed. I don't know about the Army, but I watched the Marine Corps, and the Marine Corps said, you know what? We're going to let journalists be side by side with our Marines. And if the Marines are dropping F-bombs, if the Marines are being Marines and telling everybody how screwed up the Marine Corps is, we want to know about it. And they're going to get a chance to see really how great the young Marine is. Yes, he may be, complaining all the time. Yes, he may not be the model citizen, but he's a hell of a Marine, and the journalist will walk away with his appreciation for the young grunt. And that is exactly what happened. The journalists came on board, Navy ships, and again, there were a lot of orchestrating of this, and the journalists were smart. They were like, come on, I've heard the same line every place I've been. Yet when they spent time with the Marines during Desert Storm, they got the truth of what it was like to be a young Marine, and guess what? That's a pretty good truth. After Desert Storm, all the services realized, hey, we need to embed journalists with us. Now, again, I think they didn't learn all the lessons. They still tried to shape it somewhat. But the more time journalists spend, and I can tell you downrange, even in my super secret organization, we would occasionally bring journalists in to show them what our troops were doing. And you can't help but be impressed with the young, soldiers when you spend time with them. And that is a lesson I think we should take. And oh, by the way, accountability. If we screw up, then we need to know about it. And it's okay for the American people to know about it, because the only way a general officer or a flag officer is going to fix the problem is if they find out about it. And you'll find out about it pretty quick when it hits the news.
I can attest to going in there too, and I think the media got a lot of pushback, certainly in Iraq in the beginning, embedding with the troops. It is not the only thing you should report on that, and just as you said, if you screw up, sorry, I'm here to report that too. But David, let's go back to Vietnam and talk about, first of all, the government was lying about what was happening half the time.
It was. But just to deal with that one more time, I think the embedding was great. I think that there was a government effort to make the war seem more antiseptic from above, so they wouldn't show the bodies coming back to Dover Air Base. And the real guts of a war is horrible, and they didn't want people to see that because they thought that Vietnam, that those television images turned the public against it. So there was that difference. Remind me what you just asked again. I'm sorry.
Gosh, what did I just ask him? Oh, the government line.
Yeah, the government line. So that, it's part of the way that culture changes because of the way the government acts. So the battle I wrote about was a horrible ambush. General Westmoreland went to visit the survivors of the battle, and when he said, what happened to them, they said, we were ambushed, sir. And he said, no, you weren't ambushed. They couldn't allow it to be called an ambush because it was right at the moment when Westmoreland was pushing for more and more troops. And it would have sort of hurt that effort with the Johnson administration. So they concocted a phony body count. There were 61 American soldiers from the Black Lions Battalion killed in this battle out of 140. And very, very few Viet. It was the first infantry regiment of the Viet Cong fighting against them. And the Army came after the battle to do a after-action report, and they would say, how many Viet Cong did you see? 10. How many did you see? 11. How many did you see? 10. It was the same bodies, and they added them up and made it over 100. And then, so the press fell for it in a sense and said, this was a victory for the Americans. The soldiers knew it was a lie, and they lived with that for 30 years until I went back to find out what really happened. And it's funny because you would think that would be the sort of lie that maybe they could accept because it glorified what happened. But they wanted the truth. They wanted the truth to be known and what really happened. And the fact that the government lied about that was added on to many other frustrations they might have had.
I remember during Iraq doing numerous interviews with President Bush when things were really, really bad. And asking, it was an exit interview, and I said, why did you keep saying things were going well? And he said, to keep morale up. To which I said, they knew. They knew.
The soldiers know.
Anyone exactly what was going on. When you hear Patrick Nugent, General, and I want to go back to your family and the soldiers and the long-term effects. And we talked about this, and I say with certainty that you probably think about this every single day. You were a child, but you saw it, and you had people there, your family today. Just reflect on how they are looking at this and the Vietnam veterans.
Yeah, I mean, for them, in terms of, their perspective on American veterans is veneration. And I know that, sometimes good things don't always happen in war, and more bad things actually happen. But they've always looked up to the service of our American veterans, and obviously the South Vietnamese as well. But in terms of that sacrifice, there's genuine appreciation for that. There's matter of fact, I seldom hear really anything negative. Now, certainly, it depends on the sector that you talk to. That may have experienced something of the war that wasn't so great, or maybe family members may have been killed as collateral damage during operations, which happens quite a bit. Millions of Vietnamese died during that war as victims from the collateral damage, but they don't often reflect on that. I mean, more than not, they're more amazed at how these Americans who were sent to a foreign land to fight, and some of them not really understanding the true mission or the cause of what they're fighting for, but they are willingly giving up their lives to protect our democracy. And we think it's important. A lot of time, some people may wonder why we went to Vietnam, and we can argue about that in terms of our doctrine as a nation on which wars that we should be a part of. I mean, we were involved in several wars, sir, that we didn't ask to go to. But in terms of services nation, I do deep down in my heart do believe that there's some goodness in terms of our involvement, whether you like it or not, because I think it's for us from the Vietnamese side of the house. You heard what my family had witnessed in North Vietnam, and we didn't want that, your coming to Vietnam was really God sent for us Vietnamese. So I think it's it's a point for many people to debate, but I think as we reflect on the fall of the 50th anniversary of the fall of Vietnam, the Vietnamese refer to that as Black April, and because of all the things that we suffer. Just remember, many South Vietnamese officers and their family went to re-education camp. Two of my uncles went to re-education camp, and those things are nothing more than Soviet-style gulag. They survived for 15 and 17 years, respectively, but their families were really suppressed. They were denied the opportunity to work and deny access to education. So it's the old imperial China really edict of suppression of 3 generations. So the suffering continues, right? So for us, we don't forget, And I would say this, we may not be able to forgive. I mean, it's we hang on to things for quite a while, but as a people, we went through quite a bit. And until that regime changes, it's just hard for us to have reconciliation, because if you're following the news, they're getting ready for some really, really big parades and all the peacockery that are associated with that. And, that's not reconciliation, right? If you see a rusted helmet that says U.S. on it, on one of their posters that, has an American flag as a rag in the back, it's not reconciliation. So I was hoping for things to change for the better, but if you're not willing to do that, it's going to take more years, unfortunately.
David, I want to go back to the book, and there was a great quote in your epilogue. Connections are what fascinate me, the connections of history and of individual lives, the accidents, incidents, and intentions that rip people apart and sew them back together. Kind of exactly the kind of thing you're talking about. Expand on that a little bit. I know you went back.
I did, and I went back with the hero of the book, Clark Welch, company commander who fought and led the Black Lions and tried to talk his superiors out of walking into that ambush, and failed, and felt guilty about that for decades afterwards, afraid that some loved one, a wife or a widow or a mother or a sibling, would say, "You're responsible for the death of my loved ones," when in fact he fought heroically in the battle. There are many sides to life that might seem like contradictions, sir, but really aren't. And so in this case, Clark Welch went back to Vietnam with me, along with Consuelo Allen, the daughter of the battalion commander who was killed that day. And my mission was to find the commander of the Viet Cong battalion that fought against them. And I did. Vo Minh Tret, living in Saigon, he was in charge of population control, speaking of the Soviet style, in Ward 13. And he told me his story. He was born in the South, went north, came back over what became the Ho Chi Minh Trail. And he was leading a group of men who were supposed to be somewhere else, but they were starving. They were out of rice. And that's why he ended up near the battlefield. When we reached the battle, I went there with him and Clark Welch and Consuelo, a group of people. When we got there, we found a farmer. And while we were there, after he invited me to have a meal of squirrel and snake wine, which I said I wasn't hungry, his son came, and his son had lost his left arm. And he said, this was one of the souvenirs that you folks left behind, turning to Clark Welch, because there were so many unexploded munitions in the Manioc field. But after we all gathered, we walked toward the actual place where this horrible battle took place. And it was Clark Welch, the American soldier, Vo Minh Tret, the leader of the other side, and take politics out of it and the horrors of what was going on and just put it into a personal perspective. They were two old warriors who had tried to kill each other all those decades ago. And they were walking side by side. Clark had studied a little bit of Vietnamese. Vo Minh Tret didn't know any English, but they were communicating. And they actually were connecting in a way that I wasn't expecting. And we walked through the Manioc field, and the battle took place at a rubber plantation. Inside what became a rubber plantation was a forest then. And Clark had a little GPS pendant, and I had the coordinates. And Clark said, if we turn here and go 50 yards into that forest, that's where the battle took place. And it was a beautiful, soft, early February afternoon, and the sun was coming dappling through the leaves, and we got to the place where it took place, and the commander, Terry Allen, had died hiding behind a 4-foot anthill. And we got to that place, and there was an anthill, 4 feet high, a different anthill, but the same anthill. It was that moment where history and personal connections all sort of combined in my mind to see what I was talking about there, of how, with all of the horrors of the North Vietnamese government, and I document in the book how much they lied and the killings that took place, and the naivete of the American protesters who were sort of chanting, ho, ho, Chi Minh, the NLF is going to win, not sort of understanding the reality of it. Take aside that and just look at the personal aspect of it. And it was one of the most moving moments I've ever experienced in my life.
Just thinking about the protests. Admiral McRaven, there were never really protests in the war in Iraq. Why do you think that's changed since then?
Yeah, I mean, I go back to the point about the American people. I think that one of the great lessons, as tragic as it was that we did not take care of our Vietnam veterans. And the American people learned from that. And I get back to this idea that, look, you don't have to support the war. You may not have liked the fact that we invaded Iraq. You might not have liked the fact that we went to Afghanistan, but don't blame that on the American soldier.
And I don't think they would have for the Iraq war. But
that's my point.
Yeah.
But
for the soldiers.
Yeah. So I just get the sense that there was a better understanding from the American public about the role of the soldier. And that, again, I think is a tribute to the Vietnam vets, because they understood what the soldiers were trying to do, even if they didn't agree with the war. But if you're fighting the war, if you're protesting the war, then by extension, you're undermining the soldiers that are trying to fight the war the best they can. So it is difficult. If you go out and protest the war, do the soldiers that are on the ground in Iraq and Afghanistan feel like the work they're doing is unimportant or unappreciated? So you did see some protests on there.
So it was so ingrained, you're saying, David, it was just so ingrained that you never wanted to have that again.
No, I don't, there were not no protests. There were protests for the Iraq, but not to the degree of the Vietnam War.
I mean, you had down here in Texas.
Sure.
Which is the draft.
Well, absolutely, yeah.
I think every movement
good point.
Is every movement is a combination of idealism, however you want to define it, and self-interest.
Yeah.
And in that era, the self-interest was, what am I going to do? Am I going to go fight in this war? Do I believe in it? Do I not believe in it? Your girlfriend is talking about it. Your parents are talking about it. It was just so much a part of the atmosphere of that era that also fueled the anti-war movement to a degree that the draft, when it was eliminated, it took away some of that.
He's absolutely right.
I just want to close with thoughts from each of you. We talked about lessons and tactical lessons and things like that, but if you can just focus on really the single thing on this anniversary that people should take away from that war, other than complete respect for these veterans here, what would it be?
Well, it would be complete respect for the veterans. That's got to be first and foremost in the American public's mind, is when the veteran goes to do their job, when the soldier goes to do their job, it's not the soldier who decided they were going to go. It's the commander-in-chief, it's the leaders of the country, the political leaders that decide they're going to put us in that position. The fact that we do have an all-volunteer military absolutely makes a difference. But the one thing I would offer is you have to be very, very, very careful about intervening in another country's politics, another country's civil war. Those rarely end well. So you better know exactly what your mission is and how you intend to extricate yourself from whatever you're doing. And that's got to be kind of first and foremost in the civilian leaders and the military leaders' mind. If we're going to go in to do something, if we're going to put Karzai back in power, let's put him back in power and leave. If we're going to overthrow the Baathists, let's do that and put somebody else in power and leave. We still haven't learned that lesson very well.
True.
I would totally agree with that. I know that the Johnson family members know how racked with difficulty President Johnson was during that era. At the exact moment that the soldiers of my story were marching to their deaths, it's a 12-hour time difference between Vietnam and Washington, D.C. So it was 8 in the morning in Vietnam, 8 at night in Washington. President Johnson was meeting with his war cabinet, the Secretary of Defense, the CIA director, and he turned to Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara and said, how are we ever going to win this war? And so, if you don't have an answer to that, you shouldn't get into war.
Yeah, I would second that. I think it's, for us, it's really understanding the situation that you're getting in before you commit lives to it. And we learn so many times, and we've relearned that. And even in country, particularly in Afghanistan, because it was so complex for me. I'm mostly an Iraq guy. The first task that I have in my commander's intent is understanding the situation. And by the time I left there 13 months later, I don't think I had 3 provinces of P2K right on the Afghanistan-Pakistan border there, and it nothing more complex than that. Didn't really understand the environment well enough to be able to execute the variety of tasks, not only combat operations, but also governance and infrastructure that we were responsible for. So it's we need to be real careful when we do that.
Thank you, gentlemen, so much for all your thoughts. And again, thank you. I'm completely honored to be here. Thank you.